to have him here. We are no longer short-staffed, is what that means. Hooray. It's fantastic. And he's also already just jumped right in, learning almost everything. But, might not seem like it yet, Alex, but you're doing a great job. And we are super happy to have you on board.
Welcome, Alex.
Yes, welcome. You seem like it will be a great addition. I'm really happy to have you on board for this. So.
Welcome.
And in terms of other personnel, that was sort of my big item in that point of the agenda. Everything else, Jenny is still with us, of course. So this is just an additional staff person. So that brings us up to 3. And we still have a core volunteer, Gina Lynn Potteron, who has been helping us as well for an hour or 2 Saturdays to run tokens. That's all I have for that item.
Fantastic. All right, moving on to then item 2, general market updates.
All right, I do have some good facility updates. Park operations came by, I want to say maybe 10 days ago, and we did a walkthrough of the market, talking about sort of short-term fixes, long-term fixes, things that people have been asking about. We talked about everything from creating new signs inside of the main aisle, so those large Arbor Farmers Market signs that you sort of walk under, which are attached to the roof. We're talking about maybe doing a redesign and creating new ones of those, just because there's a lot of wear and tear, and they're getting old, and it's time for new ones. And then other issues that have come up, sort of crumbling concrete in certain places. Again, just regular wear and tear. Certain areas where the pipes have detached repeatedly from the roof. Just the usual stuff. Also talking about cleaning of the market, the power washing. They let me know that it's probably going to happen in the spring because we're sort of running out of time with it not to be frozen right now. That was sort of their timeline. Other than that, we also talked about maybe fabricating new doors for the market office building. So specifically the green doors. The ones in the front are fine, but the ones on the back on the 4th Street side do have a lot of wood rot. So that's going to be sort of a longer term goal. They're hoping to fabricate some new doors for us over the winter, but not sure of a timeline as of yet. Other things we talked about were just, keeping the porta potty until we're able to open the breezeway space to the public. That's probably going to be this winter sometime. And then just other things like that, problem areas, in terms of just like the structure itself. So that is moving forward nicely. I know that they did replace also the locks on the porta potties today, because we had sort of been having an issue with those disappearing and being, cut off or just vanishing. We're not sure what was going on. So that has been rectified as well as of today, as far as I know. But does anyone have any? Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that sometimes has previous years has come up, which I don't know how the status of is the rain gutters. It seems like those have perennially, people seem to run into them and cause leaks there. I don't know if they've been fixed or if that's still an issue, but I remember that constantly came up before. So
yeah, so we were dealing with it this year, sort of like a spot by spot area. They did come out and clear it out over by the Carytown entrance in the middle of the Long Aisle, so not the one as close to the Carytown main entrance, but that sort of side entrance. But I think that's also part of just their springtime. They're going to be power washing and removing the invasive bird nests, doing that, and everything that entails. So that I think is slated for the spring.
We did just replace those as well, so they should be in pretty good shape. But like you said, I think they just need some sort of spot checking once in a while.
Totally. And this year, I feel like we haven't had as many collisions with the roof as in the past, but there definitely was somewhat of a close call on Wednesday. Someone's truck was like this close. So I think that's just, especially for newer vendors with larger vehicles, that just needs to be a reminder sent out just to be, extra aware of not backing straight into the roof.
Where did we leave off with the building, like the project we're looking into before? Can you give us a quick update on where that stands right now?
You mean for the winterization project, or?
Yeah, for like the winterization, and I think like there were a couple components to it, like looking at heating, maybe putting in more solar, and then like some sidewalls, all of that. Do you know where that stands right now?
I'm pretty sure it stands exactly where it was before that. Due to the pandemic, we're on hold, especially now, unfortunately, as Washtenaw County case rate is exploding. But there's also sort of two parts there. Was the solar piece that I'm pretty sure is still moving forward. They're talking about putting more solar panels on the main aisle. But there's also been questions raised. There is a development proposal on the table to put in a 5-story apartment building across the street from part of the main aisle. So there's questions now about, how would that impact solar placement. So I know that they're sort of working on that part separately. They're also going to be installing eventually, what was it, the hands-on museum with sort of the solar interactive tool on the outside of the office. But again, that's a longer term project that's probably not going to be at least until the spring. But that's a really great question. I know the last time we had talked, the question about fire code had come up, because if it became enclosed, then what would people do with their propane heaters? And that even if there were roof heating, that would still be problematic at ground level to make sure produce didn't freeze. So I think that's also part of the unresolved question too we need to answer before we go back to the winterization project. But as far as I know, it's on hold.
Okay, yeah, I was curious. Yeah, I think like that question of the heat and being able to use the heaters, if we can kind of keep that, get an answer eventually, I think would be really helpful, just because it was sort of like it was a big sticking point, and I think like really help guide our thinking, how we think about it more long term. And then, and I'm just curious with the solar too. That's really cool that that's still possibly moving forward. So I look forward to hearing more about that too.
Yeah, the solarization, that's part of the 820 plan. So that's sort of high priority right now, with that 2030 deadline looming. But you're right. And I think really when the architect was talking to us last, I think it was before you had joined us on here, but she had talked about sort of that, it would be kind of a no-go to have floor propane heaters if we did have like roll-up sides. The fire code would not support that. But the question becomes, what are some alternatives that we could do? But it's a great question. And yes, hopefully, once the pandemic settles down a little more, we can dive back into that conversation.
So Stephanie, one of the things that I remember from our spring meeting when the architect came is they were talking about the need to get input from the vendors. And I wrote down in my notes that they said that they were going to do that in January. And I was pushing back and saying, why not November or December? Why do we have to wait till January? And so I'd actually love an update on that process and how that's going to work and planning for that, because that was one of the other points is absolutely needing to get input from the vendors on the idea of the roll-up sides, and then also suggestions about heat and things like that. So I wanted to know where that was at.
I mean, I'm pretty sure it's at where it was before. We haven't had any movement. Unfortunately, I think when they made those projections, they were hoping that the pandemic was not going to be at the place that it is right now, unfortunately. But that's great points. And we, of course, want to get input from everybody that has opinions to give so that we can move forward. And I think, that will be, of course, the next step once we get back into the conversation.
It may be worth pinging the architects too for getting some of that, or if they're the ones who are gathering those data, because that's gathering those data are independent of the status of the pandemic. It doesn't, the action on it is dependent, but the gathering of the data is independent. So it seems like if we can gather that sooner, that would be, if it's a necessary step to go in this process, it seems like keeping that process moving forward is important. So
I do wonder though, like I'm not quite sure at this point what we are presenting. So I feel like we would really need to, I feel like we need to kind of take a step back, especially with this question of the heat, because that was such a big component. So yeah, I don't know. I do really, of course, want to get feedback, but I don't feel like personally, I don't know enough about concrete steps forward, like what we'd be asking them to input on, you know what I mean?
then that's
Yeah.
probably something to figure out too, because it seems like if we don't know what it is we're looking for, then we're going to be stuck in this position indefinitely. So making sure, what I've heard with this too is there's a question as to how much heat is required, or is heat required, and that there's no heat and no enclosure. So that's the extreme case. That's where we are now. If we had just, and I would advocate for something just simply enclosure and no additional heat, but would that be sufficient? And for some it would, and some it wouldn't, I'm sure. And so trying to figure out who or how that would work, and maybe it's a question of assembling some more concrete proposals and seeing how that could work and bouncing those off of the constituencies and seeing where that is. But that is work that can be done now and probably should be, because this is, again, I hear what you're saying about that we can't move on the enclosure part, before pandemic ends. Pandemic is going to be kind of an exponential decay, and there's not going to be like, today it's done. So we're going to kind of slowly be moving in that direction, but I don't think I have zero concern that we're just going to move too fast and we'll get walls up next week. That's never been a problem here. I think it's always been more the opposite, that it's been, even if we get very concrete plans, it's still going to take a year before it ever gets, it seems like. So, but if we don't get the steps involved in there, then we can never get to the point where it's only a year away.
Sure, and I think it's obvious that there needs to be heat. I think that's sort of like number one, because again, like it's not going to be a real enclosure per se. It's just going to be kind of rolled down sides because it can't be permanent. So I think that is really the conundrum, and it might help us in the process to talk directly with the fire department and know a little bit more about actual stuff. But that's definitely on the list moving forward.
I also just wanted to say that I think if this does not get done soon, then there's going to be fewer and fewer vendors who are coming and fewer customers too, because there are so many other alternative ways to buy local food. And, in the winter when I come, I really love to buy lettuce, but when it's 20 degrees in January, it's really hard to buy lettuce at the farmer's market. And because the alternatives, I do worry that if the market does not get winterized sometime in the immediate future, that we're looking at no longer having a year-round farmer's market. Now, that's a really dire prediction, but I also want to be honest about my concerns about that.
I hear what you're saying, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that right now. If anything, we've actually had more vendors these cold weeks recently than we have had in the past. But I hear what you're saying. It's of course important. And it's of course on our radar. But given what I've been told by Park Ops, it is probably still further out in the pipeline than the immediate future.
Thank you for the update, Stephanie, and for being open about, the questions and the input. And I know you're operating within the structure of the city, and, can imagine that's a complicated set of priorities. Is there a person or like who's ultimately accountable or responsible for this project, do you know, I've never had a sense of where it lives and if there's a person at the city, if that's you or someone else who's like, who's got the ability and the, you know, the ability, to move this forward, that, you know, maybe we could appeal to a particular department or a particular individual to come in and have a discussion with us.
I'm pretty sure it's just parks, and the people that we talked to before, that had the presentation, excuse me, Hillary in particular is one of the landscape architects. And I know she was very involved in the process before, but maybe Stephanie can speak to that, because she was more involved prior to my entry into this role.
Yeah, I think Stephanie would be right. I think it's parks, and Hillary does know a lot about the project, the background. So I think parks are the one who have always been like behind it and supporting it. Yeah, I mean, for me, the question again comes down to is, if we have rolled down sides, what options do we have for heat then? I think heat is the most important element, and roll down sides were another way to keep the wind out and to keep heat in. But it sounds like we might have to choose between the two of them. So that is sort of my sticking point. I feel like we need to answer that question first. Maybe that is what needs to be explored right now, because like Stephanie said, you know, nothing's going to be built for a while, but you know, in my mind, that's sort of what I see as a priority.
I guess one question that comes with that with heat is what needs to be heated to, in terms of, is it the guests, is it the farmers, is it the goods, is it the sidewalk to be iced, or is it all of it? And the thing that's really expensive to heat is all the air, which blows out every 10 seconds, and that's the one that we really don't maybe need to heat as much. But just trying to figure out, you know, there's this, in green building, there's a lot of discussion of, you know, there's this common adage, it's like heat the people, not the space. And so is it a matter of, if we can do that, is it a matter of upgrading the electrical and having, you know, spot electric radiant heat in various spots and solar? You know, would that net it out in a way that solves our problem with having ventilation and everything else? That's possible. I'm just trying to figure out what would work.
Yeah, and I know that was part of the proposal that we talked about with Hillary the most recently. She did talk about having heaters sort of in the spine of the roof all the way around the market, and then combined. But the issue I really see is vendors and produce, right? Because the level that the produce is at is much closer to the ground than it is to where those heaters would be placed. So my, of course, main concern is the impact on the vendors. Also, too, given that they have to be out there for hours upon hours and potentially freezing temperatures, whereas customers, that'd be nice to have them feel cozy, but it's a little bit more of an in and out thing for them. So I think, yeah, number one is vendors, comfort and safety. Number two is product, stopping it from freezing, I think. But all great questions.
So that kind of answers our question what the survey would be for, because everyone's going to have a different opinion. And my question, I guess, would be is, if we did have radiant heat down the spine of the market, we kept the customers warm because of that, and then we've always found ways before to keep our goods from freezing. So I mean, as long as there was no walls, we could still have our heaters for our goods. And then maybe in the future, so that would be like the first step would be the radiant heat down the spine of the market. And then in the future, then we'd look at closing it in. And then at that point, there wouldn't be any need for our heaters, because there might be enough. We wouldn't know till we did it. You know what I mean? It's one of those things. I'm sure there's an engineer that could tell you if it was going to, what temperature would take it down to. But I could see that being feasible depending on the amount of heaters there was. But even if there was just heaters for the customers, I think that would be I think that would be good, because without the customers, there's no reason for us to even be there. But I mean, we're also making it work the way we are now. So it's, it is what it is. But I know we put a lot of effort into all this to get to this point. And, anyway, that's all I got to say about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And my only concern is when Hillary did talk to us, she made it seem like if we had the roll down sides, we couldn't also have heaters at the table level or below. And I think that's really the question that we need to ask is, what exactly is the fire code? What are some ways that we can work with it and make sure that it works for everybody? And, for the customers right now, we do have those rollout ambient heaters. We need to actually bring them back. They're currently in storage at Wheeler, but we can bring those back. So at least we'll have those out in the market. Like I know that was one thing Stephanie did to make things a lot more comfortable for customers. So we do have at least that right now as sort of a holdover. But all great feedback, and I will definitely be inquiring with upper management at Parks to see, how we should proceed, how we get the answers to these questions.
And Holly, did you have something?
I think what I was going to say is, I think you're right, Stephanie, that there are some questions that need to be answered. I just don't know who's in charge of answering them, I guess. It's like, who actually gets them answered? I don't know who that is.
I mean, Stephanie, I can speak when I was kind of working on this. I think, again, it was Parks, and then we had to work closely with fire department and building engineers, like city code building, don't know their exact title position, but the people who are in charge of keeping building codes up to standards, to make sure we were all in alignment with that. And so it was kind of working with a couple different departments, but again, like Parks, and then Parks working, I think Stephanie's idea of talking to possibly like the fire marshal and building codes would be the place to start.
Yep, and I'm sure that Park Ops has their own suggestions, and Jason in that particular realm, and or Scott, I think could help us too.
Great. Are there other comments or thoughts before we move on? All right, then moving on to events.
All right, so there's been a lot of questions whether or not we're having holiday events. We're not. It's still the pandemic. Also, with that said, a lot of folks have been asking us about Kindle Fest. Of course, Kindle Fest is not our event, it's Carytown's, but a lot of times people think we run it because it's at our space. So that is also not happening. I know that the Carytown District Association is doing sort of like a Friday night trying to get shoppers out into the neighborhood initiative, but that doesn't really impact us this year. We're of course hoping to come back next season, next holiday season with full programming, getting a lot of the kids events back, getting, all the fun stuff back that people keep telling us, we miss it, when is it coming back? But we just haven't had the ability to do it safely. But that's for sure on our list. And now that Alex is here, a lot of this winter, we're planning on focusing on rejuvenating our events calendar, planning stuff out in advance and acting as if we're going to go back to not necessarily pre-pandemic, but a more safe delivery of events and a larger roster of events for next year as well. So, but other than that, I don't have any specific items in there in terms of events. It's just I wanted to give you an overview of our long-term goals and what we are looking at with that.
Sounds great. Any comments, thoughts? All right, then moving on to COVID-19 protocols.
All right, so we're getting closer now that it's too cold. Our final hand washing sink has been removed. So now we're back down to our sanitizing stations. They have just been rejuvenated as well with a fresh battery, so they should be working well. And that's the next step, is really thinking, and again, the case rate this week has sort of made us pause a little bit on wanting to bring people back into the space. I've talked to my bosses. They sort of were of the impression that we don't really need to open up the breezeway area until January at the earliest. There's also that brand new ordinance in which we will have to provide free of charge feminine products to everybody in our bathroom. So hopefully that would coincide with us reopening those facilities as well to the public. But the other thing too really is staff feelings of safety. Not sure yet how that would look like in terms of having to go back to mask requirements for the public in our space, because of course they are required, but it's just about the enforcement piece of that. So we're sort of vacillating between those things. Don't have a full start yet, but I think January 2022 seems to be a good time to maybe think about opening the bathroom specifically to the public. I don't think we're going to open the office up yet. And that's I think a separate conversation, because a lot of things would need to change for us to go back to how it was before. We would have to change pretty much the whole layout of the office area that was moved to sort of utilize our, walk-up window or whatever you would call it. But part one would be, sort of getting that back open, the bathrooms available, getting rid of the porta potties outside, and sort of moving through that. Otherwise, masks are still required indoors at all city parks. I found out yesterday that as of yesterday, 91% of all city staff have been vaccinated. The deadline for vaccines for them is tomorrow. So I'm assuming that's going to be at 100% by the end of the week. But that's pretty exciting news, at least from a staff standpoint, and that we are providing a safe space for ourselves as well as for any members of the public that would be coming in to the bathroom area. But other than that, I don't really have any broader updates, although there's been a lot of questions, and I should have mentioned this in the facility piece. There's been a lot of questions about the one-way tape on the floor still, because there are some people that are confused. The real issue, it's very difficult to take up. It's very sticky. They were thinking, maybe it would be power washed. Maybe that would help. They're kind of unclear about that. So that's one of those things. And again, it being cold, probably not helping our case for getting that removed. So that's definitely a long-term goal. Also, in order to just, not give the public confusing and conflicting information that you don't have to go one way down the market any longer. But that's all that I have for the COVID related protocols.
Any comments or thoughts? Sounds good to me. It's a lot to manage, so I kudos to you for trying to navigate those waters. That's not easy. So.
Thanks, but at this point, I don't know any other way, because this is all what it's been like since I've been here. So
You're a pandemic market manager expert.
I guess.
All right. So let's move on to item 3, sign-in process rule change continued.
All right. So this, has been an object of conversation the last couple meetings. We were focusing one meeting on the sign-in process itself. The other part was about the parking rule change. And I know we had sort of gotten to the point where we wanted to share with the market vendors and come back. And now that Alex has joined us, that is something that we can actually have a chance to do. But I just was wondering, if anyone had any more feedback, things that sort of came to you in between meetings, other things that we hadn't addressed, but we can go from there.
I'll be quick. I did have a chance. I did think a lot more about our parking question. Personally, I feel like it's important for vendors to have kind of a first dibs on the space behind them in the summer, just because thinking about space and how valuable it is at the market. Loving the opportunity to be able to use that space for either display or storage, because there's so much backstock in the summer, and having more space for display helps me compete better with some of the larger vendors, and so it gives me more of an advantage. You know, I'd love to just hear what the vendors' feedback is on that, maybe to help solidify what we want the final answer to be. But that's just my thoughts on it. And two, you know, just if we were able to have a little more clarity written out about, like, I think I mentioned this before, like your process for like all of that work that you do to make sure everyone gets in there in their preference in order of seniority, just so like when we pass on that job, then it's easy and clear, like the steps you go through to be able to make sure that all happens smoothly. If there were a way to like spell that out a little better, I don't know what that would look like, but I think it could be helpful. Yeah, those are my only two comments. So.
All right, thanks. Anyone else?
And I think also, yeah, and getting the vendor feedback is still, and that was something, a piece that we were missing beforehand. And I can't really speak to it because I'm not a vendor and I don't really ever observe this process, but I have heard a lot of folks, you know, it's a common topic, and it is something that does seem, it's been on and off an issue, just in terms of for all the years I've been here too. So it's something that and I, you know, if we have a chance to do another iteration of it to make it better, I think that's clearer or more transparent or fair. I think that would be a win. I'm sure we'll never get it to perfect, but I think there is an opportunity to make it better, and to make it a little clearer. So I think it's worthwhile identifying what those points of pain or frustration are and seeing if there's a concrete way we can kind of push that forward. So I support that.
So I guess the question for you, Stephanie, is just in thinking of the timeline for this, when do you think you'll get vendor feedback? I know we gave you a lot of comments and input, and do you need us to look at another draft of the rules? You know, just sort of thinking about the process moving forward.
Well, right now, since we're coming up on the holidays, it probably makes sense to wait until the new year. They're really, excuse me, to involve vendors in that, because I know this is a very, very busy time for all sorts of vendors, not just farmers, but everybody. I mean, holiday gift markets for artisans, special orders happening for prepared food people. So, you know, it is one of the busiest times of year for local products in general. So I would think, you know, I could maybe send out an email or something like that. But I think in terms of maybe doing a canvas or talking to people in person or doing interviews or, you know, something more than just like a basic survey, I think really needs to wait until the new year. And then even then, you know, that's sort of the lean time of the market in terms of who's actually there. But obviously for those folks that aren't available on email specifically is who I'm addressing with that. Maybe, I don't know, mail out a questionnaire to people. But yeah, I was sort of targeting to start that new year, because again, right now it's just a really difficult time with the holidays coming up. And, you know, end of season plus the frost being so late, it pushed people at least 2 weeks behind from normal farm schedule as well. So
I guess one way between that could be to actually work up what that questionnaire would be, and then present that for next time, so we can then kind of iterate on that, so we at least have the concrete set of the questionnaire to make sure that we're kind of on the same page for what that is. And then that may not be sent out but they will be sent out till in January or something like that, so that then first establishing what the questions are. It's kind of like the same thing with the enclosure thing in terms of you can't send out the questions before you know the questions. So figuring out, making a proposal for the questions, and then we can, that's something concrete to discuss, and then sending it out and discussing the results that came back. That we've done that before in other things where it's nice too, because if you use something either like just a more strict form or something that, you know, Google Forms or a written thing, then they can all be consolidated. You can look at everything in parallel and get really a more coherent sense of like, yeah, really, this is a non-issue. We didn't know that, but it's among all the people surveyed, it's really, or it's only for one person and everyone else is really totally neutral on that. Those are very helpful pieces of data.
Yeah, another option too, since we will be sending out people's applications next month, that also might be something we could even include with those mailings. So that way we don't have to overload people with stuff that they're getting, and put it with something that people are already going to be looking at, because of course it's a requirement for them to give us their updated information on updated application.
That's a really good idea. Yeah.
We'll make a note of that. Okay. All right. All very good. Anyone else want to chime in about this? Well, all right. I think that's a good next step, Peter.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, something concrete. Okay, so then we'll move on to item H, new business. Does anyone have any new business they would like to bring up? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to item J, second public comment. This is not limited to agenda items. Do we have any members of the public here?
Let me see. I'm not currently seeing anyone, but we'll just give it a moment. I am still not seeing anyone.
All right, yes, well, seeing no one, then we will move on to item L, adjournment at 6:13. Thank you all, it was great.
All